Families are rare in the animal kingdom. Most animals only mate for a few minutes and then never even see their offspring. Like sea turtles, for example. Sea turtles, when they mate, they go their separate ways, and then when the mother lays their eggs, they leave. They never even find out if their eggs hatched. So the kind of families that we have as humans, it's kind of an anomaly. You do see it in a few other species, but in the species that do have families like ours, those kinds of family structures seem to exist for a clear evolutionary purpose. The animal species that have these kinds of families, they typically have offspring that cannot fend for themselves after they're born. It takes those infants a long time to grow up and become self-sufficient. But modern human families exist for a different reason. Modern human families exist for economic reasons and emotional support reasons, child-raising reasons. So times have definitely changed, but the influences of evolution are still there, and they're still very strong. And when we look at the human family as a system, what we see is that it's heavily interactive. Despite what a lot of older theories state, parents are not like the end all. They're not all powerful. Like that's the kind of stuff Sigmund Freud was talking about. Specifically, Freud focused on the relationship with the mother, which is the child's first relationship in most cases. So, though parents do have a strong influence, both directly on the children and in other more indirect ways, there are many other influences to consider as well. Because if you really think about it, families don't exist in a vacuum. Families are inside of a larger society, and that society is nested inside a larger culture, and so on. So there's levels to this kind of social influence that can affect the development of a child. So the parent-child relationship is just one of many different potential influences on the child's development. So yeah, you should think of this as a heavily interactive system. You could call it the system's view of families, where the father and the mother affect the children, but the father and mother also affect each other, and the children affect each other, and the children affect the parents, and so on. So all those possible combinations of interaction are going on simultaneously. And then this, family unit is nested inside that larger kind of social structure that I was talking about. So we're referring to things like your neighbors and your coworkers and your classmates and extended family and so on. All those individuals you do see, but not on a daily basis. And then that larger social structure is nested inside of the a largest one that we just call culture. So culture, you should think of culture as like social influence from people you've never met or people who have long since passed. Culture is like social influence spanning generations, basically. But as I was saying, when we just look at that core, of the family and how the different members of the family affect each other, there is definitely a lot of interaction there. You could call it like a reciprocal influence on the child's development. What I'm saying is, from birth, children do actively influence how their parents treat them. Some children are born more temperamentally fussy, and that will irritate the parents, and it will cause the parents to not be as affectionate. It will cause the parents to be a bit more hostile towards that baby, and then that hostility is going to further reinforce this baby's fussiness, and it just turns into this kind of a cycle. And as children develop and they get older, the way they treat their parents will change, and how the parents respond to these changes should change in accordance with that. Like, parenting styles do tend to differ with the age of the child, with the child's cognitive development and the child's just genetic personality traits, that temperament. Just to name an example, Adolescents tend to desire more autonomy. So they do tend to push away their parents to a certain degree, and how the parents react to that, desire for autonomy can have a dramatic influence on the child's development. However, teenagers, adolescents, they do often want to talk to their parents, and they are genuinely curious as to what the parents would do in various kinds of dilemmas. Like they do defer to the parents' decision-making capabilities more often than not. But when it comes to how the parents affect the children, there are a few different ways that this tends to manifest. Here are the 4 basic kinds of parental behavior. So, first of all, there's direct instruction. So that's when the parents just literally tell the children what to do and when to do it and why. Then there's coaching, where the parents will help children master various social skills and emotional skills and explain like links between behavior and emotion. Then there's modeling, where the children will learn by observing and imitating what the parents do and say. This involves imitation and counter-imitation. And then there's feedback, where parents can increase behavior through reinforcement, like giving a reward such as candy or a gold star or something, and decreasing other behaviors through punishment, like giving the child a timeout or taking away their cell phone or something like that. So there's a lot of different things parents do, but these are the 4 basic kinds, you could say. So children affect the parents, and parents affect the children, but the children also affect each other, as I was saying earlier. How a child's siblings influence them can be pretty dramatic, but not all children have siblings. And just in general, when a young child hears that they're going to have one, generally this is seen as a positive thing. The little kids like the idea of having a little brother or sister. However, when that baby does eventually arrive and reality sets in, the older sibling commonly becomes a bit distressed and immature and maybe even withdrawn. And that's because they didn't realize that all of the love and attention and focus that they were getting from friends and family is now going to be offloaded to a certain degree onto this new sibling. But there is a way you can minimize this, negative reaction that children tend to have, and that's through attentive parenting. So just, even though the new baby is very cute, you should also make sure you're not ignoring the previous child. Make sure you pay equal attention to both, because that child will notice if there's any kind of parental favoritism at play. And just in general, when siblings start to grow older and they start to develop a relationship, that relationship does tend to be a bit more harmonious if they are older, like they've reached adolescence, if they are of the same sex, and if they have some degree of emotional intelligence. They're not too emotionally unstable. So those are a few important factors. But for a lot of kids, whether they have siblings or not, for a lot of kids, they don't enter a family at birth. They have to go through some turmoil and eventually are adopted into a new family. That's just a reality that about 2 to 4% of children in our country have that kind of experience, where the first few years of their life are just very unstable, and they don't really know what to expect next when it comes to their family life. So typically, adopted children have experienced some adversity, in some cases fairly extreme adversity, if they had, for example, abusive or neglectful parents. And as a result, adopted children seem to be more prone to conduct disorders and school adjustment issues. And this probability goes up if the child was older at the time of adoption. So kids who are adopted still in infancy, you probably won't see this as much. But if you adopt a child who's already reached the teen years, they're more likely to have a wide range of behavioral and emotional problems and such. But this may actually just be an artifact of the data. This might not actually be entirely accurate, because what we generally see is that biological parents tend to be less willing to admit that their child has a problem. Adoptive parents are much more likely to talk about these kinds of issues and seek help for these kinds of issues. Now, one common myth when it comes to family structure and siblings is the impact of birth order. The common myth is that firstborn kids tend to be, the favorite, and they tend to get the majority of the focus. And that is, in fact, true to a certain degree. Firstborns generally do have pretty enthusiastic but inexperienced parents. And as a result of this, they tend to be the guinea pigs. So they get the best and the worst from the parents' interactions. So yeah, they get a lot more attention, but they also have to live up to much higher expectations. And this can lead a lot of firstborns to become quite bitter or resentful if they don't think that they're meeting those expectations. Laterborns, though, basically they are more complacent. And the further down in that birth order you are, the more complacent the parents tend to be, and the less interested those children are in satisfying the parents' expectations. So, like a child who's born second, a second-born, would still get a lot of attention and get a lot of, expectations from their parents for success. But if you're like the fourth or the fifth-born, it's pretty unlikely the parents are even gonna talk to you all that much. I mean, it's not that they don't love you. Of course they love you. It's just they don't really feel like they have to try that hard. They feel like they've mastered these kinds of skills, and now they're just kind of coasting at that point. So yeah, a lot of laterborns, they're just not all that invested in this relationship with the parent. Another myth is that only kids are spoiled. Due to this excessive parental attention, if a child doesn't have any siblings, they'll become selfish and egotistical. But the reality is that only children are in fact much more likely to do well in school and have higher levels of intelligence and self-esteem. If you think about it for a few minutes, that should make sense. These only children, they're getting the full focus and effort from those two parents. Those two parents are entirely invested in this one person. So they can give their best, and they can spend a lot more time with that child than they would be able to if there was multiple children. So this is in fact a very good thing to have only one child. In most cases, this seems to be very beneficial. And those concerns about egotism and selfishness, we generally don't see that. We don't really see any differences in personality or popularity, for that matter. Now, I was mentioning earlier that parents affect each other and children affect the parents. It's a heavily interactive family system. And if those parents' interactions with each other are not harmonious, if there's a lot of conflict there, that can obviously do some serious harm to the development of their children. It will jeopardize the children's feelings of stability. They won't feel comfortable in their own home. It'll just make them anxious, frightened, and sad. And those negative emotions will affect their own relationships and their performance in school and things like that. And just this conflict in general between parents, it will divert their attention away from the child. If the parents are so busy fighting with each other, they're not going to have any time to spend with the child. And the source of conflict, the most common source of conflict in marriages, is financial issues. Unemployment and work stress, those tend to undermine parenting skills. So whether you're in a financial unstable situation or not, parents need to try to cooperate. Obviously there's going to be conflicts, but the children shouldn't have to deal with those conflicts. Parents should try to model a good, healthy relationship, at least when the children are present, because that will foster the child's relational development skills. Parents need to work as a team in that regard. But not all conflicts can be so easily mitigated like that. Some conflicts become so severe that it results in divorce. And how divorce affects the child depends on, once again, how well the parents can cooperate. Just because you're getting a divorce, that doesn't mean you can't cooperate on that. And another really important factor when it comes to how well the parents cooperate is how they treat the child during this process, especially when it comes to disciplinary issues. But regardless of what parents do, when a child has to experience a divorce, they do tend to have problems. They have problems with their academic achievement scores. They have problems with their behavior at school, their conduct. They have problems with adjustment and self-esteem, self-concept, and they just have problems developing a good relationship with both of those parents. They also tend to be more likely to experience negative attitudes about marriage, have marital problems themselves when they grow older, and have a higher rate of divorce. And then finally, another consequence of going through a divorce is just, in general, these individuals have a lowered life satisfaction and experience depression more often as adults. So divorce has a lot of negatives to it, and a lot of these things are pretty much impossible to avoid completely, but there are things you can do to try to minimize the negative impacts of divorce. One of which would be to do what's called joint custody. This is a custody agreement in which both parents retain legal custody of their children following a divorce. And this can be a very effective parenting strategy if those parents can get along. They have to be able to cooperate at least to a minor degree for this to work. If that's not an option for some reason, then sole custody is how these children will be raised, and children do tend to fare better when they're raised by the same-sex parent. Now, these negative effects of divorce do tend to be more harmful for children who are between the ages of approximately 6 to 18, are temperamentally emotional, like they have a lower emotional intelligence, and children who are more pessimistic, who interpret events in a more negative way. And to help these kinds of children deal with divorce, parents should, first of all, not try to compete for the child's love. Any amount of competition between the parents for the child's affection is going to backfire, and it's going to make the child resentful towards those parents. Secondly, you should talk to the child about the divorce, explain why the divorce happened, and reassure them that it's not their fault. It's not due to anything that they did. And third, you should make sure to reassure them of your love and involvement, even if you don't get to have custody of them for the majority of their lifetime. You want to make it clear to them that you do care and you want to be there, but the divorce just isn't going to make that easy. So you need to just reassure them that you're going to be involved even if you're not always there. But perhaps the most important thing is that you do not try to put down the other parent. Any amount of criticism of that other parent is going to be internalized by the child. They might not fully realize it at the time, but when you criticize that child's other parent to the child, when you say these kinds of things when the child is around, they kind of take it personally. They understand at some degree that that parent is part of them, So it's kind of like you're criticizing the child in an indirect way. So you need to make sure you don't do that kind of thing. I'm not saying you have to like the other parent. I'm not saying you have to praise the other parent. Just don't criticize that other parent in front of the child. Now, following a divorce, it's quite common for people to remarry. And when you do that, you might enter into what we call a blended family. This is a family consisting of a biological parent, step-parent, and children. And in these blended families, we tend to see a slightly higher divorce rate, especially if there are stepchildren in the family. And children do less well in school and tend to report more depression when they're in a blended family, but they can profit if both of the adults are caring and involved. And just in general, older children, adolescents, they do tend to adjust the worst to being in a blended family, especially if the stepfather brings their own children. But being in a blended family, it does have some risks, but it's generally seen as a good thing. It's a good thing to have two involved caring parents, and it's good to have siblings that are, going to cooperate with you. So if you have a good relationship with these other individuals, a blended family can be a wonderful thing. However, in some cases, when it comes to issues of divorce and blended families and things like that, in some of these cases we do see some problematic behavior. We see child maltreatment. Now, about 3 to 4 million US children are neglected or abused in some way. So 75% of these cases are neglect, typically. This is where the child just isn't getting adequate food or clothing or medical care. 15% of cases are physical abuse. So this is where the child is assaulted, leading to physical injuries. 10% of cases are sexual abuse. I don't even want to talk about that. That's a very upsetting statistic, but that is unfortunately real. And then 5% of cases are psychological abuse, such as ridicule, rejection, or humiliation. So like I said, it's unfortunate, but it's true that this does happen. It happens all around the world to varying degrees. But there are certain risk factors that we can keep an eye out for to try to identify which children are likely to be abused. So here's just a list of a few of these risk factors. So risk of maltreatment is higher if the family is poor, if they're socially isolated, so that just means the family doesn't have any relatives nearby, no real, close friends nearby, no extended family. If the parent's culture condones physical punishment, so if you come from like an ethnic group or a cultural background that tends to sponsor physical punishment, it's more likely to occur. New parents, so parents who lack effective parenting skills, they do tend to be more likely to abuse their children in some way. If the parents' relationship with each other is, troubled, if the parents have a bad relationship, that's another risk factor, because they do tend to take out their hostility on the children. Younger children are at a higher risk for various reasons, but one of the more obvious ones is that younger children do need a lot more time. They need a lot more effort when it comes to those parents, and that can make the parents resentful or hostile. Another risk factor is if the child is not biologically related. So when it comes to blended families and stepchildren do tend to be abused to a higher degree simply because the parent doesn't see that individual as their child. They just see that individual as like a burden. And another risk factor is if the child is frequently ill. So children who are ill, regardless of what age they are, those children do tend to put a lot higher demands on the parents' attention and the parents' time. And some parents just can't respond to that very well. Some parents just don't have the time. They don't have the energy. or as I mentioned before, they become hostile. They become resentful towards that child. Now, in our country, spanking is still common, so we do see abuse somewhat frequently in our country. Though times are changing, the laws are changing, and physical punishment of any kind is slowly being eliminated, not just in our country, but worldwide. Of course, there's going to be certain cultures that will perhaps never, relinquish that kind of punishment, but it does seem to be a worldwide change for the most part. And these children who do suffer from these kinds of abuse, even if there's no lasting physical damage, they do tend to suffer, in some cases in permanent ways. For example, they tend to have poorer relationships with their friends. They tend to have more behavioral problems at school. They're more disruptive. They tend to get lower grades and test scores on individual tests. They tend to have cognitive developmental delays. They tend to experience more depression. And when they do grow up and become parents themselves, they tend to be more likely to do the same forms of abuse that were done to them. So it can result in this really unfortunate cycle of abuse spanning many generations. But some kids are more resistant to the negative effects of abuse than others. This is a psychological trait that we call ego resilience. So some kids have higher degree of ego resilience than others. So you could define ego resilience as the person's ability to respond adaptively and resourcefully to a new situation. So these children with a high ego resilience, when they are neglected, or when they suffer from this kind of maltreatment, they can adapt, they can react, they can adjust to these changing conditions, and they won't have a lot of those negative consequences as a result. Just in general, children with a high ego resilience do typically have a more positive idea of their parents, the mother in particular. So even if the mother is being very neglectful, they'll still look to the mother as a kind person. She's doing these things, she's, neglecting me because she has to work to earn money for my support. So they just have these positive representations. And ego resilience can be a very powerful buffer against these negative effects of neglect. But when it comes to the other forms of abuse, it tends to not be so helpful. So just in general, when children are abused, it can result in some pretty harmful consequences. But there are a lot of factors that can modify how harmful that is. And one of the more important factors is just these kinds of personality traits that children have.